Yeah, so I want to talk about spontaneity, horizontalism, and organisation, and I think that these are key issues to be dealing with after the past 18 months and the transformation that we've seen in terms of anti-capitalist politics across the world. We've seen, I think, over the past 18 months or more now, the explosion of enormous social movements and a multiplicity of struggles, from the revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa to the movement of the Indignados in Spain, similar protests at Syntagma Square in Greece, and of course we actually saw some of the earliest manifestations of this new spirit here with the student movement and the student revolt in Britain, and of course we've also seen the worldwide growth of the Occupy movement, starting in Wall Street and then expanding across the globe. And what we've seen, I think, in this period is a sense in which, in the popular consciousness of a substantial number of people, of millions of people around the world, there have been battle lines drawn between, on the one hand, the 1% of the population who have ended up with all the benefits of the last period of economic growth that has now come to an end, and of course everyone else, on the other hand, the 99%. And during this period what we've seen is an explosion in writing and theorising about the nature of these movements and protests, both in print, in books, and also of course online. There's been a massive expansion of online writing about social movements, and so you have familiar reference points for people who've been involved in these kinds of movements. People like Guy Debord and Michel Foucault nestle alongside the likes of Clay Shirky, the New York University professor who writes about the impact of new social media on movements. And we've also seen, of course, the emergence of new strands of Marxist thought from the likes of Slavoj Žižek and Alain Badiou, who've been around a lot longer, but also newer writers, people like Nina Power, Mark Fisher, who've become incredibly popular and have also been participants in the movements. And I think that amongst all of these very, very eclectic ideas, there are a couple of common sense sort of things that have run through a lot of this, which have been encapsulated in a lot of ways in what some might think is an unusual, from an unusual and unlikely source. And that's Paul Mason, who is the economics editor of the BBC Current Affairs programme Newsnight, who wrote a book called Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, The New Global Revolutions. And in this book, he says that why is it happening now? Ultimately, the explanation lies in three big social changes: in the demographics of revolt, in technology, and in human behaviour itself. And for Mason, the demographics of revolt refers to the interplay between three sections of society. On the one hand, the graduate with no future. There's also the urban poor and slum dwellers, and also the organised working class. He also talks about technological changes, so the rise of the internet, social media, the ubiquity of new technologies like smartphones and laptops. And also he claims that these kinds of changes have led to significant transformations in the patterns of human behaviour, and led to the possibility of developing a new model of human freedom called networked individualism. Now, I've written a couple of articles in the ISJ criticising a lot of these ideas, but I also think that we have to look at what's of use in them and really try to, in some way, to try and demystify them, because I think that if we look at the practice of some of the movements that Paul writes about in his book, and indeed if we look at other movements historically, I think that a lot of these, there are a lot of ideas that represent an almost automatic and default position for new activists who get involved in radical political activity. And I think the two of the key ones here are spontaneity, the celebration and often the reliance on the spontaneous activity of either small groups of people or indeed masses of people, and of horizontalism, the rejection of leadership or hierarchical forms of political activity in favour of leaderless, decentralised networks of activity. And the metaphor of the network is something that's become a very, very dominant idea amongst those people who seek to move beyond political organisation over the last few years. I want to discuss these two concepts, and I want to both look at them in terms of the historical experience of spontaneity and horizontalism, but I also want to try and unpick and demystify what they really mean, what they describe, and what animates the processes behind them, because fundamentally I want to argue that left to simply spontaneity and horizontalism, the movements will be ultimately ineffective in the struggle against capitalism and in the struggle for human emancipation. I want to start by talking about spontaneity. What do we mean by spontaneity? I mean, there's a sense in which we look at a lot of events as being spontaneous. They've just come out of nowhere. And for example, we can think back to the student movement in Britain in 2010. I mean, before the day of the protest itself at Millbank, who would have predicted that there would have been 50,000 students on the street, that we'd lay siege to Millbank and occupy the Tory headquarters, or that 2 weeks later there'd be 130,000 students and school kids walking out in protest, or that a couple of weeks later still there'd be an enormous militant siege laid to Parliament itself by masses of students. And yet these things happened, and they occupied colleges, lecture theatres, new layers of people came into activity for the first time. And yet these huge and militant displays of activity failed to stop tuition fees, and within a couple of months the marches had shrunk to a fraction of their size, and people began asking, why is it that this could happen? Consider this passage. In the student movement, there was a stress on spontaneity. Such structurelessness fitted situations of sudden explosive involvement of very large numbers of students for the first time. As they took to the streets and occupied buildings, they unbalanced the authorities and did not worry unduly about strategy, tactics, and organisation. But none of the swarms succeeded in going beyond shaking the established power structure to destroying it, and it was not long before it was hitting back. Now that is a passage that in a lot of ways I think almost perfectly sums up the experience of people who were involved in the student movement of 2010. The thing is, it was written by Chris Harman in 2003 about the student movement in the United States in 1967. Now I don't say this as a gotcha, although if I got you, gotcha. But really what I want to try and do is show how these kinds of explosions and experiences have happened again and again throughout history, and left to themselves can't move on to settle accounts. But at the same time, I think we have to bear in mind that spontaneity is a crucial aspect of all political activity. I mean, if you think about revolutionary politics, some people say that the role of the revolutionary is to create the revolution. So Che Guevara said the revolution is not an apple that falls when it is ripe, you have to make it fall. Now, for some people on the left, I think that this can lead to quite an elitist and voluntarist conception of political activity, that all we need is to go out there and wake people up, wake up the sleeping masses, and that this will create a revolution. Actually, within the classical Marxist tradition and the revolutionary socialist tradition, there's a very different conception of spontaneity. For us, the spontaneous activity of the masses is of crucial importance. So consider this quote from Rosa Luxemburg in her pamphlet, The Mass Strike, written about the Russian Revolution of 1905. She said, "The sudden general rising of the proletariat in January under the powerful impetus of the St. Petersburg events was outwardly a political act of the revolutionary declaration of war on absolutism. But this first general direct action reacted inwardly all the more powerfully, as it for the first time awoke class feeling and class consciousness in millions upon millions, as if by electric shock. The proletarian mass, counted by millions, quite suddenly and sharply came to realise how intolerable was that social and economic existence which they had patiently endured for decades in the chains of capitalism. Thereupon there began a spontaneous general shaking of and tugging at these chains. All the innumerable sufferings of the modern proletariat reminded them of the old bleeding wounds. I mean, quite aside from being an incredibly powerful passage, this really does capture the sense in which spontaneous activity can give rise to enormous social movements. The revolution wasn't the result of a conspiracy hatched by small groups of people, and in fact it was very much a widespread explosion. But I think we have to actually start to unpick what we mean by spontaneity here, because I think we get into a problem if we just leave things as spontaneity, say things happened automatically. I mean, what are we actually trying to say? Because if we're saying that, actually we're giving a very mechanical idea of how things change. Things will change because people will reach a level of suffering and poverty and misery that will just make it impossible for them to carry on like that, and they'll create a revolution. And of course, if this were the case, then we could all just go home. Why bother being involved in politics if change happens automatically? In fact, in a lot of ways, this seems like the flip side of the old reformist conception that workers will gradually develop the consciousness that will enable capitalism to transform into socialism. The process might be different, but still there's an automatic and mechanical driving force. I think we have to actually unpick what we mean here by spontaneity. And the first person to quote on this, I think, is Gramsci, the Italian revolutionary, writing in the Prison Notebooks, where he says that pure spontaneity does not exist in history. It would come to the same thing as pure mechanicity. In the most spontaneous movement, it is simply the case that the elements of conscious leadership cannot be checked, have left no reliable document. It may be said that spontaneity is therefore characteristic of the history of the subaltern classes, of the popular classes. What does this mean? You know, if you think about it, the idea that all of a sudden people move, or 1 minute there isn't a revolution, then all of a sudden everyone has become revolutionary, it almost makes you think that workers are like the Borg in Star Trek, with some sort of hive mind and automatically start to act. Let's try and think about it in more practical terms. You know, if you think about a wildcat strike and a load of workers walk out of the factory or an office, who is the ringleader? A student protester occupies Millbank and smashes up the windows. Who makes the first move? Actually, in a strike, sometimes it's a trusted militant, sometimes it's an angry new trade unionist who will call, right, all out, and call people out, and people will go along with them sometimes. On another day, you know, they might be ignored. At Millbank, you know, there were hundreds of students and then thousands of students who marched in to the car park there at Millbank, and then a small number of people forced the doors open and people followed in behind them. And I think that what we have to say about this is that this is leadership. It's relating to the anger of the workplace, the crowd, the masses, in order to initiate activity. You know, and the way that you decide whether or not it's the right time to do these kinds of things, well, it's certainly not that you just stand there and constantly repeat the same slogan in the hope that, like a stopped clock, you'll be right occasionally. You know, you think of some people who've carried the same headline of General Strike Now for the past 40 years or something. I think that that's probably not the best way of approaching that. So what is it that also feeds into the sense of spontaneity? There's leadership involved as well. But also think about that last line from Luxemburg. All the innumerable sufferings of the modern proletariat reminded them of the old bleeding wounds. Now, the academic Alex Levant suggests that this points to another element that's important to the understanding of actions that appear spontaneous, and that's the way in which history impacts on our present day activity to drive us beyond what we once thought was possible. So think about Walter Benjamin, a German Marxist, writing in his theses on the philosophy of history. Not man or men, but the struggling oppressed class itself is the depository of historical knowledge. In Marx, it appears as the last enslaved class, as the avenger that completes the task of liberation in the name of generations of the downtrodden. This conviction had a brief resurgence in the Spartacist group being the Rosa Luxemburg's organisation within the German Social Democratic Party. And this idea has always been objectionable to Social Democrats. Social democracy thought fit to assign to the working class the role of the redeemer of future generations, in this way cutting the sinews of its greatest strength. This training made the working class forget its hatred and its spirit of sacrifice, for both are nourished by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than that of liberated grandchildren. Now, I think that what's being said here isn't that reformism has meant that, workers have all had their minds wiped and they no longer care about history. It's about what is that motivation that brings people out into activity. Social democracy is a reflection of the idea that capitalism can only be transformed slowly, gradually, but that things certainly need to change, reformism, but workers are also capable, as we've seen, of enormous upsurges of anger. So what we understand as spontaneity, I think, are instances of leadership that is often unrecorded, that catches the mood, the spirit, the anger of those involved. And sometimes this involves a few dozen, but sometimes it involves a few 100,000, a few million. Marx actually summed up this process, in a way, in the 18th Brumaire, where he says that men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Now, some people might take that in a purely negative sense, but actually think about the next line. And just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionising themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirit of the past to their service. And so you can see how the way in which history informs the activity of the masses. The history of injustice and injury, but also the history of resistance and rebellion. But I think then it's a mistake to assume that this process delivers somehow an automatic transformation. Spontaneity is not the same as being automatic. Without organisation, this guidance from history can be blind. How do we generalise the best experiences of the class and learn from the worst mistakes of the past? And this is crucial at times of low-class struggle, when organisation is necessary to keep revolutionary traditions alive. But it's even more important at times of political and social unrest. To quote Chris Harman again, it is common for people involved in upsurges of struggle to believe that what they are doing is something completely new. And often they do indeed develop new ways of struggle. But there are also invariably some patterns of development similar to those seen in the past. In particular, the thinking of many people involved in the new struggles continues to be marked by the assumptions of the society that they are struggling against. Their attitudes are a mixture of their deference to established ideas with the radicalism which comes from beginning to discover their own collective power. They have a contradictory consciousness, which is partly revolutionary and partly reformist. What then is the role of leadership in such a process? Well, we know that Rosa Luxemburg celebrated the spontaneity of the masses, but of course she was always a member of political organisation as well. First as a revolutionary inside the Social Democratic Party, and then after the capitulation of social democracy as a founding member of the German Communist Party. And in 1918, when the German masses rose in revolution and brought down the Kaiser and ended the war, they were unable to go beyond that spontaneity because of the hold of the Social Democratic Party and reformist ideas on the one hand, and the weakness of this very newborn Communist Party on the other. So how can we conceive of winning an argument for a revolutionary transformation? How do we know when the time is right to go forward and when we need to retreat? How do we learn and generalise from our experiences? And I think in this respect, organisation becomes crucial, and the limits of horizontalism become very apparent. I think most people should be aware now of what horizontalism means as a leaderless, decentralised network. often with consensus decision making, and very much an idea that leadership or power is corrupting. What I want to do is look now at the more recent movements to understand what's going on there, to try and unpick it again. I think that the thing that leaps out at me when I've been writing about contemporary social movements is the way in which this idea of the network has become an incredibly dominant metaphor. Not only to understand relationships between activists, but also more generally in terms of trying to understand capitalism as a whole. So if we look to Paul Mason again, he builds on the work of the theorist Manuel Castells and his idea of the network society to argue that the combined impact of the social network and the individualistic self would facilitate a clear break with old forms of organisation, including parties, unions, and permanent campaigns. I think some of the problems with this position, though, is that far from breaking with the kind of conceptual framework of neoliberalism, is that in fact it internalises them. And I want to give you a little quote from a writer called Kevin Dugan, who will be speaking this weekend. He writes in his book, The New Capitalism, The Transformation of Work, that writers like Castells belong very much to a wave of theory that accompanied neoliberalism and in which market forces appear naturalised. And he says that whereas discussion of old capitalism might invite consideration of social classes as agencies and the distribution of incomes as outcomes, new capitalism is a confluence of narratives that captures and represents the world in terms of abstract and self-sustaining social processes. In the absence of strategic actors such as governments, corporations, or classes, social processes appear disembodied. And I think that the reduction of the analysis of society to ideas of networks is very much a part of all of this kind of thing. Dugan suggests that if there were a similar shift in medicine, for example, it might lead to a new haematology, exclusively concerned with the flow of blood around the body, yet remaining wholly uninterested in the heart. Why should this be important to thinking about social movements? Well, I think that in a lot of ways, this idea of the network, this metaphor of the network, has seen its flip side in modes of organising amongst a lot of the new movements. So if you think about the Occupy London camp, the Occupy LSX camp, there was an overwhelming obsession with process as opposed to ideology. Now this is something that we can all recognise from previous social movements, but I want to talk about this one in particular. You know, can't we get away from the old way of doing things? We don't want to talk about old things like capitalism, you know. We want to talk about new and positive ways of doing things. And of course we do want to talk about new and positive ways of doing things, but what we saw in practice in a lot of these situations was that a lot of time is spent discussing how decisions are made rather than making decisions. Think about the way in which consensus decision making often means that only those with the time and the eloquence and the expertise to be involved in the process actually are involved in making the decisions that they finally come to. And I think that a lot of the time that we have to remember that the fall of Stalinism, the rightward shift of social democracy, the decline of the revolutionary left, during the period of neoliberalism has meant that many activists really reject, you know, not only traditional form of reformist organisations, but also revolutionary socialism in favour of new common sense forms of activity that seek to get away from the old problems of organisation. And so one way that we can see this in practice is the elevation of the tactic of an occupation to a strategic imperative. Why is it that the occupation and the occupation of physical space is so important? Well, partly it's about overcoming the need for a political party. You know, you have an organising centre where an organisation remains informal and consensual. You don't need to worry about how do we keep things going when the camp is gone. But of course, the camp does go. And similarly, the concept of the network is something that has come up again and again in the social movements. And I think that one of the real problems that we have with the idea of the network is the problem of strategy. So if you look at Mason's book again, despite his constant assertions that the network defeats the hierarchy, actually the picture of the horizontalist movement in Britain leaves us, that Paul Mason leaves us with, is incredibly bleak. He says that the movement which grew out of the student occupations is left in a crisis of direction that it is still struggling to recover from. The reason being that the problem was that youthful, socially networked horizontalist movements would everywhere have a problem: the absence of strategy. Now, I wrote, before his book came out actually, I wrote an article on the role of social media in social movements. And in that article I argued that this very problem would emerge, that online networks are not going to be a problem to the question of strategy. Because Paul Mason argued earlier on, just after the fall of Mubarak, in fact, that ideas arise, are very quickly market tested, and then either take off, bubble under, insinuate themselves into the mainstream culture, or if they are no good, disappear. So this was going to be the solution to strategic questions. If it catches on, it'll catch on. If it doesn't, then it's dead. The problem with this is, what do we mean by good or bad? How does it have any bearing on how effective these actions are in bringing about fundamental social change or in challenging the rule of capital? The danger of deciding tactics in this way is that it opens the possibility that activism that is very rewarding in the short term is taken up at the expense of strategic thinking about long-term goals. Everyone would rather, dress up and dance around Liverpool Street Station handing out leaflets and throwing flowers, and I don't think there's a problem with that, and I think there should be room for more of that. But if people had the choice between, well, I could do that, or I could go to a bus garage at 5 a.m. and try and sell a socialist worker paper, if this is the only criteria for how we're going to organise ourselves, then we can start to see how that might be a problem. Because I think that the tendency to talk about networks in this abstract way leads us into a real blind alley when trying to understand what's gone on. Because I think that fundamentally it's unnecessary to polarise between networks and organisations. There was one blog post that I read last year, I think, which I thought had a wonderful little passage, which just says, networks are not an alternative to organisation. A network is just an analytical device that sociologists and computer scientists use to understand relations between actors. Networks contain organisations, and organisations contain networks, both formal and hierarchical, and informal and non-hierarchical, as well as everything in between. So really imposing horizontal networks as an alternative form of political activity to organisation, the real arguments and the real differences are being mystified. Because in fact what's really being argued here is that we're rejecting centralisation in favour of everyone doing their own thing and having completely decentralised ways of doing things. So given the problems that decentralised networks of activists have in formulating strategy, I think we have to conceive of a method of activity that employs a level of centralisation. The problem that you get is you run up against an objection with this, which is that the organisation leads towards development of elites, always leads towards the development of elites. So if you think about two activists who were heavily involved in the student movement of 2010, Aaron Peters and Guy Aitchison, they wrote an article on the outsourcing of radicalism, where they say that those who back the power of networks are content for the movement to remain precisely that, a social movement held together by on and offline networks and formulating a shared identity. Whereas those who want central organisation argue for the effectiveness of hierarchy, a form of organisation which is in any case inescapable as de facto leaderships emerge in a process described by Robert Michels at the beginning of the 20th century as the iron law of oligarchy. And the iron law of oligarchy, summed up by Colin Barker, sitting at the back there, he says that this is a view that organisation engenders both oligarchy, the emergence of leaders who can prevent challenges to their rule, and conservatism, the diversion of democratic movements from their original goals. And Michels believes that this stems in part from the incompetence of the masses, which is almost universal throughout the domains of political life. Now, needless to say, Michels was not a Marxist. He was a member of the German SPD before becoming a member of the Italian Socialist Party, and then eventually following Mussolini into fascism. But I think that Michels is undoubtedly pointing towards tendencies within organisations, but he does so from a very reactionary, very elitist and very pessimistic starting point, and without any material explanation of where such tendencies can arise from. Really what he does is accept what Duncan Hallis, one of the early members of the Socialist Workers' Party, described as a secularised version of the original sin myth. I think that there's a real problem with this, because actually there's another side to things. John Molyneux recently, in an article that he wrote on democracy and revolutionary organisations, said that in opposition to Michels' iron law of oligarchy, there exists in any party or organisation whose leadership does not wield the combined sticks and carrots of state power, an almost universal law of democracy. In any voluntary organisation where membership does not itself confer material privilege, there is an element of democracy in that the leadership requires the consent of the rank and file in the form of its continuing membership and support. So if we can move away from this dichotomy between networks and organisation, and away from this fatalism that assumes that all political organisation is destined to lead to the gulag, it becomes possible to conceive of radically different organisational forms which have the ability to resolve strategic and tactical questions in a necessarily democratic manner. And in this sense, I think you have to understand a revolutionary socialist party as a network. One that is not hierarchical, but is centralised in order to most effectively develop strategy and implement tactical decisions. The strength of the party form in this respect is that it allows for a method which is both centralist and democratic, which allows for both swift action and an inclusive method of decision making that doesn't simply give power to those with the time and the skills and the energy to be absorbed in process. And this network of revolutionaries, this revolutionary party, must in turn be part of other networks. Networks of activists in the anti-cuts movement, rank and file networks in the trade unions, networks of student activists. And it's the very fact of this cross-cutting nature, of this intervention in all of these different groupings and networks that allows members of the Revolutionary Party to maintain an understanding of the levels and unevenness of class consciousness amongst workers and other activists. They can learn from the most advanced layers of the class with whom they are engaged in campaigns and activity, but they can also gain an understanding of the views of the less politically conscious people around them in their workplaces, in their offices. And this network is then able to feed the experience of the class to a democratic forum that can centralise it and attempt to formulate strategic outlooks and implement tactical decisions. And this relationship has to be two ways. It has to be one which relies on deep, deep political trust amongst the leading activists of the organisation at a national and a local level, and between those activists and the people outside the party that they interact with. So socialist organisation has historically taken a number of forms, but in order to be effective against capital, it must be made up of a well-rooted network of revolutionaries who are at the heart of the struggle. So to sum up, I think spontaneity, properly conceived as outbursts of struggle in which the leaders may not be self-evident, but are fueled by anger and bitterness and a sense of revulsion, is a crucial aspect of any process of social transformation. But on its own, it's not enough. While it can catch the ruling classes off guard, without a revolutionary strategy, eventually it'll be defeated. And so revolutionary organisation is a network which seeks to organise the most militant layers of the class so that we can build the struggle from day to day and to relate to other workers and be implanted in the class, so better to be able to win a strategy within it. Now, revolutionaries are always a minority outside of a revolution, but a strong, embedded revolutionary network, a revolutionary party, can be a crucial part of building the struggle. Whether it's intervening to get the mass strikes put on the 30th of June last year and the strikes that came before that, of forming mass united fronts against war, against fascism, against austerity. educating its members in the history of our movement so we don't simply repeat the mistakes of history. Fundamentally, we live in a capitalist system in which workers are the source of all profit. And workers, therefore, have the strategic position within capitalism to stop exploitation and fundamentally to change the world. But then, just as now as historically, consciousness amongst workers is uneven. And political organisation and revolutionary organisation is simply recognition of the fact that some people break more quickly with the established ideas of existing society than others. And those who break first need to organise themselves to win others to their ideas and to counter the manoeuvres of the ruling class and the state. And that's what we mean by revolutionary organisation. And just finally, I think that my last thing that I'd want to say is that for people who are here who aren't involved in revolutionary organisation, I hope that over the course of the weekend that you'll hear some of the arguments, you'll hear some of the ideas, perhaps you can raise your own ideas, your own objections, and think really about what it means to be involved in these kinds of revolutionary organisations, what it means to be effective as an activist against capital, and who knows, maybe by the end of the weekend you'll want to join the Socialist Workers' Party. That would be lovely. But I'm just going to leave it there now and open it up, because it'd be quite interesting to hear what other people think, if people have got disagreements and whatnot. So thank you very much for listening.
First off, I'd like to say I came in here not expecting to agree with much which was said. I'm a computer scientist and anarchist, so I came out of here. I came in not expecting to agree with much which was said. It's okay, I'm an anarchist and computer scientist, and I happen to be both, so I was kind of at a loss there. But first off, I'd like to combat the idea that consensus is an elitist form of decision making, which selects for those which are eloquent. With a good facilitator, we try and do away with those things as much as possible, and we are comparing it to a system of elected democracy, where it is one person, maybe a small committee of people at the top, which are making the decisions for the masses. Secondly, I'd like to combat the idea that spontaneous movements can't achieve anything. I was involved in an occupation in our university. We went in this was last Christmas, we went in expecting to be in for about 5 hours. We were in for a week. At the end of it, at the start of it, we had 50 jobs threatened. At the end of it, none of them were. Spontaneous organisations are very effective and they're very democratic. We need to combat this idea at the start. I'd also like to combat the idea that the party is the only method for revolutionary change and the only effective one. And also, you started off your thing saying if you're not already a member of revolutionary organisation, then you should join one, and I ended it with you should join the SWP, implying that it's the only revolutionary organisation. If you're not already a member, shop around for a bit, make sure that the one which you choose agrees with your ideals. Just because we're offering leaflets, it doesn't mean they're the only one. Join one by all means, but don't necessarily go straight for the SWP. The SWP does have, and I hate to say it, a reputation for not being democratic in comparison to other organisations out there, and most of the other political parties which seek elected office, be it councillors or MPs or whatever it may be, have the same problems, and as such I don't think that the party is a good revolutionary tool. Thank you.
Hi, Selma from MPA France. I think the question the comment Jonny Jones is raising is really key and important, because these are more than concepts, these are very important tools to build a political anti-capitalist organization. In the context, it was precise, and the fact is that this political situation in France is since 1995, so very important movements that came to challenge the question of power, but without political organization that could put a step forward. So we are in this situation that could explain that those last years were some kind of instability in terms of organization. Whatever you say about networking, the point is that finally, even after big movements have been witnessing movements like the CPE movement, the LRU movement, which was focalized which was taken mostly by people who were fighting for networking, but without, continuity. Anyway, I'll try to be short about this, but the point is that whatever happens, we need an organization that further and put a step forward about that. So the question of course, I was a member of the LCR, the Communist Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, and in 2007 we've been thinking about how can we, as an organization, take this new situation, take it charge, and building into something new. But the point is that contrary to the SWP's internal democracy, so the LCR was much praised for its internal democracy, allowing tendencies all of the time, but the point is that the NPA today is a failure because it didn't break from its former way of organizing, rather than, and in this point it's important to define what spontaneity is, when you mean by entering what new movement brought into and changing and building a new leadership that could grow into a revolutionary party. So we've been thinking that much about that, and this new aspect was mostly from the students' movement, and especially for the 2005 riots movements from the suburbs. So we've seen many young people, men and women, coming into the organization, building something new and bringing something new, and new ways of organizing. And the new challenge the old way, but didn't succeed. So in this situation, spontaneity could be useful to build a new revolutionary leadership. So it's, I think, very delicate. It's not just a matter of opposing, as you said, spontaneity and organization, but organization is sometimes, spontaneity could be necessary for real organization making. Now we are in the situation of a step backwards, so we are more trying to keep up contacts, building networks, building movements. Like one of...
Start summing up now.
Okay, I'll try. Okay, one of the... I'll say two things, I'll try to be fast. One of the organization within the movement is necessary, as we try to build a movement called Summer 2012, trying to link rights movements in France and racism and Islamophobia and Arab revolutions. So, but organization is always important in that situation. And the other debate we have also, and it is kind of a question, because of what we try to implement, is the question of the self-organization in neighborhoods and self-organization of workers, and the link with how can we build and improve our political organizing according to this new situation. We had some factories, experience of factories that were self-organized but with limits, and the question of organization is crucial in this context of political and economical crisis, rising quite in a high level. So these were, I think, the debates we could have about this.
I think it's very important to realize that although the last 2 years doesn't make that, it doesn't feel like that, but most of the time it doesn't really matter what we do and not much changes, and sometimes only a small spark creates a big leap. And I think this is a very important reminder of why there's a big difference between spontaneity as defining a momentum or a social phenomenon, and spontaneity as a system or a form of organization. And those are two very fundamental different definitions, which I think lead to a lot of the confusion and sometimes unnecessary knee-jerk reactions also to what we understand by spontaneity. I think especially when you couple this with the debate about what is called leaderlessness, and I think you touched upon it in terms of this whole essential point of rejecting centralism. I think that's where a lot of the, hallelujahs about spontaneity are sometimes another way of saying we are against leadership oppression. And I think those are again two things that we need to take serious, because they happen on the ground and it's not something that people make up. I think that this conference is an example of how that doesn't work. And I'm really happy that the first speaker is an anarchist comrade who comes up and actually explains his own issues and criticism. This is exactly what we mean by sort of horizontal, spontaneous form in terms of relating to each other, which is quite different from in terms of organizing. For my own experience, I've been active in the Netherlands and I'm active in Oxford. For me, personally, my experience with a lot of the autonomous or horizontal, self-defined horizontal groups is that there's often, because of the lack of hierarchy, which actually just comes down to the lack of a division of labor, because that's what it is, that it's less transparent. So my experience has actually often been that, whereas with certain traditional organizations or my own comrades in the party, it's clear who's doing what, and I have this direct sense of accountability. With some of the autonomous, horizontal, whatever you call it, experiences, it wasn't really clear, so there was a much less sense of accountability. And so in practice, not as transparent. So I think when we have this discussion, you have to be as concrete as possible and speak from your own local experiences. And I would like to leave it at that. I have so much to say about internet politics, but Jonny knows that it's my field and you can ask me later. But I think this point of spontaneity as a momentum, as a phenomenon, which I love, it creates creativity, and spontaneity as a form of organizing, which is totally a different debate. It's unfortunate that they have the same name.
I don't think that's an unfortunate coincidence. I think there is a distinct ideological sense in which both the word spontaneous and the word horizontal draw together a variety of different meanings and kind of clutch them together. And a lot of the general discourse and chatter about these terms tends to sort of slip back and forth between the different meanings. Now, I think for that reason, when Jonny said that it's important to unpack the different meanings of these terms, that's the important point. Jonny mentioned that this notion, that the notion of the network itself is, if you like, neutral as to what the actual structure of that network is. You can have a network that is centralised or one that doesn't have that kind of centralised organisation. And I think that's an important point to be drawn out there, that too often in these debates around horizontalism, there's an equation made between hierarchy, conceived as a top-down, powerful person at the top telling not so powerful people at the bottom what to do, and centralisation as a kind of efficient way of organising a group of people. Certainly, what I understand as revolutionary organisation involves centralisation, but I don't think it involves hierarchy in the sense of a pyramid, or if I'm at work and the manager tells me to do something. I think that goes. So I would argue that you can disentangle those two things. Similarly, on the question of spontaneity, I think we need to distinguish between an understanding of spontaneity as what is unexpected and unpredictable, and I think there is a very, very strong tradition, if you look back historically, of understanding on the socialist left and more widely, of the creative power of the masses. I mean, the classic example is 1905, Russian Revolution then, which throws up this notion of a workers' council, a Soviet, which had never been done before, never been thought of before. Lenin's initial reaction to it was famously one of incomprehension, but coming out of that, the understanding that that was a way of organising the masses threw up spontaneously, it then becomes incorporated into a wider field of understanding. And this latter point, I think, is the point at which the sort of discourse that romanticises spontaneity stumbles and falls, because if you romanticise spontaneity in that way, all you end up saying is spontaneity is great. Now, spontaneity by definition is the stuff that can't be organised, can't be predicted. So all you end up doing is paying lip service to this kind of creativity without actually drawing out the lessons from these historical phenomena, without bringing them together, without adding them to our sum of understanding. And consequently, we miss the unfortunate fact that all of these great, creative, spontaneous movements have so far failed. We haven't got rid of capitalism yet. And if we don't pull together the experiences and learn from the mistakes and draw on the insights that they throw together, we aren't going to complete that process. And so for that reason, I I would argue that a centralised mode of organisation, of understanding and of knowledge, can draw these things together in a very unhierarchical and democratic way, and that to me is what revolutionary organising is about.
I wanted to come back on what the person said over there about consensus and democracy. Briefly on the SWP. My experience in the SWP after being in trade unions and kind of occupation movements is actually the SWP has been far more democratic, and actually my voice has been heard a lot more. But I want to come particularly on this question of consensus, because when you think about a strategy for a movement, you're faced actually sometimes with two different opposing choices where a consensus or a compromise or a fudge is not possible, and the politics of consensus aren't possible in that situation, otherwise you just kind of abandon or relevance. I want to talk particularly about what happened in East London when the EDL tried to march down there. We faced a choice. Did we go with what the council were doing, vast parts of the movement were doing, and some people should have known better, and go and try and ban the EDL and call on the council and the police to ban the EDL, or do we build a counter-march? The problem was, these were two mutually exclusive options. We had to come to an agreement very quickly, and we had to implement it, and that's what makes that form of democracy, where you agree on a strategy and you implement it, perhaps even if you didn't agree with it. When you've got two mutually exclusive options, that's what you've got to do. But more on consensus, really, because I think it's something that people in the movement, people in the anarchist movement, have problematised. I mean, there's a fantastic book called The Tyranny of Leaderlessness by an American feminist, I've forgotten her name. Which goes through actually what came to dominate the feminist movement in America, were kind of white middle-class women at the expense of all sorts of different voices. And there's a big debate now in anarchist circles about consensus decision-making. It goes something like this: it's very good for small groups where they're making high-stakes decisions. Do you want to occupy here? Do you want to occupy there? Your little affinity group of 12, 24, 30 people, it works because it ruins your life. But if you think about other forms of organisation, particularly where you've got mass social variation, I think you need another form of decision-making, a more democratic form of decision-making. Because you think about a strike where you've got social variation, where you've got men and women, where you've got ideas about sexism, racism, where you've got all these different things swirling around. And particularly you've got a section of people perhaps that don't want to go on strike, that want to scab, that have got all sorts of backward ideas. There's no consensus there. So I think our point about democracy is sometimes consensus is not possible, and sometimes you have to actually put your hand up and say, I'm going to have my right to disagree, or actually have your right to, I'm going to use this word, repress a minority. If that minority wants to stop the strike, there's no consensus in that. You have to go with the most advanced section of the working class and try and repress the side that wants to kind of break your strike, repress the side that wants to use racism and sexism to divide the class. So that's my tuppence worth on consensus and democracy. Sometimes I don't think there's very, very much democracy in what can appear as the quite formulaic consensus decision-making. Thank you.
It's to come back on the anarchist comrade who said that the party's not a good revolutionary tool. Again, there's a problem there. It's the anarchists do really struggle with this. There's a book by Stuart Christie called We the Anarchists about the FII in Spain, which is a very good read, actually, if you don't want to then become an anarchist. He quotes at one stage Michel's at length about the iron law of oligarchy. Quotes that at length. Several pages later, when he's recounting the events of 1936, where the anarchists pulled back from creating a revolution and effectively go into alliance with the Republicans and become part of the government, Republican government, by the way. He talks about the problems with the anarchist movement of not being able to call their leaders to account because they didn't have the structure to do so. They didn't have the. In fact, they celebrated this, and I think that's really important. Schmidt in the Black Flame. But excellent book about the anarchist movement, although he's selective about what he thinks is anarchism. Talks about this tyranny of structurelessness. That's all part of the problem. And I think here it's not just a question about networks. I think it gets to the fundamental problem of anarchism, which remains class or individualism. Because at the end of the day, you have to define: are you part of a class that's prepared to march together and strike together, or are you going to retain your individualism and opt out of a decision? And at the end of the day, when it comes to things like strikes and that, you can't retain that individualism. It's class against individualism. It's not to say that we're oppressive in that sense, but to realise your power as an individual, you have to realise it as part of a class. That's how you fulfil it.
Yeah, I agreed with the talk. I wanted, really briefly, I wanted to say one thing. Jonny said that, you know, in especially new movements, everyone sort of has this illusion that, you know, we're doing this for the first time, and sort of a libertarian anarchist mood can be quite dominant. And I do think that is, on the whole, true, but I think that at the same time, especially in student movements or sort of spontaneous, you know, sort of like the Occupy movement, I think that especially this sort of, I would almost call it, you know, sort of this individualist, sort of neoliberal autonomism can also be very much a turnoff for a lot of people. And, you know, I've been in plenty of occupations and consensus rounds where I spend the whole time talking to people on the fringes who are annoyed that we've been discussing about how we're going to discuss for 5 hours. So I think, even though it's true as a generalization, there are always a lot of people who, even in their first experience, are fed up with these ideas, and we shouldn't, assume that at first everyone agrees with this. We should, from the beginning, be both looking to, relate to the anarchists and the autonomists, but also to relate to all the people who aren't interested in those ideas and are looking for a more solid organization, or who maybe just want to vote by majority because they want to go home because the meeting's been going on for 4 hours. But that this sort of character isn't necessarily static, it isn't necessarily a given. And then the point that I thought was the most interesting about Jonny's talk is the idea that anarchism, or at least the anarchism that we have now, that we have in the Occupy movement or in student movements, is very neoliberal and very individualist. And I think it's important that there's a clear difference or a clear, division being drawn between maybe the anarchism of the CNT and sort of early anarchism that had a real mass base in the working class, and the anarchism today, which generally doesn't. Maybe there are exceptions, and I think my experience, and especially the student movement, especially as soon as spontaneous movements lose a mass character, but these sort of autonomous politics continue to dominate, they can become very narcissistic, very individualist, and can be a huge, huge break on the movement, because these ideas can sort of create an echo chamber effect, where if you spend a long enough time with 50 people in a room talking about autonomous ideas, eventually you're no longer willing to accept any majority decision. And this sort of reinforces this notion of individuality, and really can rob a movement of its collective agency and of sort of a class-conscious ideology, because the role of individuals becomes so important. And it can really hinder the development of revolutionary strategy. Because last thing that I'm going to say, because this individual focus removes strategic questions from the debate. And I live in Germany at the moment, and I tend to think that it's particularly bad in our movement, but I've had debates at movement meetings where no one is talking about strategy. People are really only talking about their feelings. And when there is no mass character, and this is only in situations where the movement is small and weak. When the movement is large, these problems are taken care of by the momentum of a social conflict. But when it begins to ebb, that's when revolutionary organization, revolutionary strategy becomes really, really key. And last sentence, I think it's important that, especially when the movement is on the up and up, and there are these debates, and there are a lot of people you can relate to, it's important. What do they keep breaking over there? It's important then that you make the arguments, because the alternative, and I think a lot of people, when I look to my parents, for example, they can't stand the autonomy stuff. They've been getting really active in the labor movement for the last year, so they have become pretty hard left reformists, because at least they make majority decisions and seem interested in actually winning something. And ultimately, that leadership can be just as bad, if not much, much more disastrous than any sort of anarchist or autonomous leadership. And so, don't just assume that this is sort of the mood of the movement. We should be always arguing for revolutionary organization, and I think majority decision making is one of the best things a movement can have.
I think when we're talking about spontaneity, we need to be clear about one thing that happens in capitalism time and time again. Capitalism wants to squeeze workers, it wants to force us to work longer, it wants to raise tuition fees, it wants to do various things, and out of that basic conflict, you have spontaneous movements, because workers say we won't take it any longer. You have students say we won't take the shits that we're being fed. And out of those spontaneous movements, effectively, revolutionary organizations have a task. How do we relate to those kind of spontaneous movements? That's the real question, as revolutionaries, that we have to face. Is it simply enough to stand on the sidelines in those spontaneous movements, or is it fact that we have to to take the past experiences, as Jonny says, give and also try to be part and parcel of them and try to shape the direction of those spontaneous movements. And the example that I think is very elusive is the Chilean students movement. And I've been reading on the Chilean students movement for ever since 2010. And what really became clear is that at the beginning of the Chilean students movement, it was really marked by this kind of carnivalistic, kind of anarchisty, total emphasis on spontaneity whatsoever. Like literally, you would have the main unions and they would call a demonstration, and you would have the majority of the students not marching on that day because no, we can't of course march on that day because the main unions have called the demonstration on that day. What has become clear is that the neoliberal governments are not going to concede in any shape or form. The Piñera government is not conceding. What students are talking about over the last half a year, 6 months, and will continue to talk about, is effectively how can we build a revolutionary, anti-capitalist organization in Chile as a direct response which can start to link up the various different struggles. And I think that's something that even Paul Mason starts to acknowledge. Another example, and I think in a way really the discussion has been superseded, is no one is talking anymore, as it was in the students' movement the case here in 2010, about the fact that online networks can replace somehow offline networks. What people like Aaron Peters, who's a friend of mine, is actually now talking about is, he's going back to Negri, the early writings of Negri, where Negri says we need a revolutionary organization. He's reading Lenin, and what he's saying is, we need to come up with some kind of organization that can start to, take all the online networks that we have and put them into the real world. And why are these people coming up with the ideas? Because they see the limitations of what spontaneity can deliver on the ground. But why do people actually choose to emphasize spontaneity and horizontalism? I think what we need to see social movements as is a site of class struggle in which different social forces, social classes try to give immediate expression to their interest. And in that sense, you can see very much that the occupations in the students' movement, which were dominated in the 94 groups and in the Russell group, were based on horizontalism. At University of East London, at the post-1992s, in the most case, you had very good voting character, you had the trade unions coming in, and you had no Twitter account set up for them. It shows the limitations as well, but what I'm trying to get at is the point that actually inside of the working class there are strong traditions, and those traditions need to be part and parcel of the kind of movements that we're getting to at. And the SWP has a role to play in bringing those kind of traditions into the movement in order for the movement to succeed and hopefully win in the struggles ahead.
I'm not really sure if I'm saying anything new. But I think one thing we have to remember is that there's not like a dichotomy between either sort of horizontal or centralist organisations, and I don't think we have to make a choice between the two. I think what people are right in saying that sort of horizontal organisations can be very limited sometimes. But I think at the same time, if you have like an organisation that focuses entirely on sort of Leninist democratic centralism, you get inevitable problems like splits and stuff. And then you have obviously sort of the absurdity of different political parties. It's in a way the right revolutionary organisations to join. I think also if you create a formal organisation, you create a distance between that organisation and sort of the mass of people themselves, and you have this sort of rationality that's based purely about sort of membership and recruitment and stuff like that. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think any revolutionary movement's going to involve millions of people who've never been involved before, and hundreds of thousands of people leading it who've not been kind of known to the movement, not been organised before. Every revolutionary movement does that, and I don't think the debate about organisation in any way takes away from that. That's what a real revolutionary movement looks like. But within that movement, you always get big debates about what to do next. And I think the problem is you always get people on the right intervening in that debate. You'll get the state, or whether through the media or through special, MI5 or whatever, trying to intervene and pump ideas to limit the movement, and the reformists arguing to hold it back and not go too far. And the question really is how, when you've got those debates going on in the middle of a revolutionary movement, how we win. And I think, there's been an argument which I think is quite interesting, that the, social networks and so on speed up the spread of ideas and so on. But if you've got one side organising to try to win that argument, the right wing organising to try to win that argument and derail a revolution, it seems to me madness that our side doesn't organise to try to win that to win that argument. Because if one side's organised and has got resources, financial, organisational and all the rest of it, and the other side hasn't, they've got a massive advantage, and surely we need that advantage on our side. And the sort of organisation I think we'd need would be very big. I think that's the first thing to say. I think you'd have to have hundreds of thousands of members, and I think it would have to be really rooted in every workplace and college and community, so that we can learn from what the movement's doing and try and generalise from the best ideas and the best things that are going on. And a few comrades spoke about some of the weaknesses of the SWP, and I'm sure people could debate whether they're right or wrong, but I think it's kind of missing the point really, is that there's no organisation anywhere in the world that's the kind of organisation we need to win a revolution. And the question is how we get from where we are now to where we want to be on the eve of revolution, which is having that organisation in place. And I think the question people have to ask themselves is, where's the best place to start to try and build that? And I think any organisation you pick will have its weaknesses, size being the most obvious one, but in terms of political, the way to organise, all kinds of weaknesses and all kinds of arguments about how to address those weaknesses. But we have to start and we have to try and tackle those. And I think that's, for me, that's why I'm in SWP, because apart from anything else, it's bigger than all the others put together. And in terms of what it's doing in all the movements, it's mostly getting it mostly right. And I think that's a good starting point then for trying to build something that is what we need, rather than the various organisations we've got today, which clearly aren't.
There's one thing I wanted to say though. If I implied that spontaneous movements can't achieve anything, I don't. That's certainly not what I'm arguing. Can we simply rely on spontaneity to settle accounts with capital? I don't think we can. But certainly, I mean, in how are we to understand spontaneity? I mean, would we accept that the revolution that brought down Mubarak was a spontaneous revolution? Well, yeah. In that sense, yeah. I think we would. But that isn't to say, though, that when we really unpick what do we mean by spontaneity, we actually can see that there were elements of conscious leadership within that movement. There were very different layers of conscious leadership within that movement, representing different political ideas and different political strands. And also there was a weight of history that was pushing towards it as well. I mean, just before the revolution, I'm not sure if it was a year before, there was a fantastic collected edition that was published by some people, a guy called Phil Marfleet, who's in the SWP, which is called Egypt, the Moment of Change. This idea that things couldn't go on was something that people understood, but at the same time, that doesn't mean people were like predicting that these things were going to happen. The question though is, what next? And so when we look at what's going on in Egypt at the moment, we can see that the progression, what's happening there, is certainly not spontaneous. There are organisations, there are actors with different balances of strength that have different interests that are participating in that movement. And so in that kind of situation, if I was in Egypt right now, I'd want to be in that organisation like the Revolutionary Socialists that are in Tahrir Square, that are talking to the young revolutionaries, that are selling their paper to spread their ideas, that are seeking to intervene in it. But that it's certainly not to say that spontaneity, that spontaneous movements can't achieve things. God knows I've been involved in some of them. I think that the one comrade raised, that these might be the common sense ideas in the movement. It's not that everyone thinks like that. I completely and utterly agree with that. I remember actually being at the occupation at the LSE when the student movement began, and one of the first discussions in the occupation was, how do we make decisions? There were some people who argued that we should have consensus decision making. There were some people who said that we should have just a simple majority voting, and there were some who said we should have about 66%, and that was a sort of a fudge position. I just remember the first thing that Robin turned around to me and said was, we have to recruit all the people who said simple majority decision making. And so I mean that way in which, of course, we're constantly engaged in trying to reach out to people. I remember that just after the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy London, I was quite involved in that movement. Right afterwards, the very first General Assembly after the eviction, there were groups that were set up. There was like, right, how do we talk about the very practical deal of how do we now take another camp as soon as possible? And actually what I realised quite quickly was that not everyone was up for that. So I said, well, I want to start a group for people who think that we shouldn't necessarily be diving straight into taking another camp. I'm thinking about what else we need to be doing strategic. And I had 20 or 30 people around me who I could then have quite an interesting and serious political discussion with. So I think that that's absolutely right. I think that some of the things that Mark talks about there, about how when movements come up against a wall, the momentum starts to ebb. Actually, people start looking for alternatives and different ideas. I mean, this is true historically as well. If you think back to, I mean, I raised the example of 1967 in the United States and the student movement there. What happened in 1967 when the momentum went out and people started looking for an ideology? Actually, what happened is a very, very nasty and quite hardline Stalinist, Maoist organisation called Progressive Labour entered the Students for a Democratic Society and managed to polarise the debate in there so much that people who had months before been arguing about structuralistness suddenly found themselves adhering to one or another type of very authoritarian Stalinist politics. The question then is, can we provide an alternative that doesn't go along those lines? And I think that this is why what Ian raised at the end is so absolutely essential. We want to be involved in all of these movements, but also all of those people who are looking for the way forward, trying to think about what the next step is. We want to be having all of those discussions. We want to be involved in all of those discussions, and we want to be putting our argument. We want to be saying, well, I think that this is what we need to do. We should also not imagine that we'll be able to carry everyone along, that we'll always be able to convince everyone that it's that what we're doing is the right thing to do. But as Marx said, without division, no progress. At some points there will be splits, there will be divisions. What we want to do at all points is try to win an argument with the widest layer of people, to be engaged in those debates about the way forward. And also I think that within the SWP, we have a very, very clear and a very, very simple set of ideas in a lot of ways that we want to put across as being part of the organisational solution that a lot of these people now face. That's not to say that we just go around saying join us or we're not interested. We always want to be involved in putting these arguments forward, and that's really what Marxism is about. I mean, where else are you know, you don't just have to read Negri, you can go and listen to him talk on Saturday, you can listen to people from all kinds of political backgrounds, and really an event like Marxism, a festival like Marxism, I think is an indication of how absolutely committed and dedicated an organisation like the SWP is to being part of that process, of having those discussions, of being part of a wider movement and saying, well, let's debate and discuss and maybe disagree, but actually when it comes to the crunch we'll also link arms against the bosses, against the government, and I think that that's a crucial perspective that we all need to have. So I hope everyone really does enjoy Marxism and gets involved in these discussions, gets involved in these debates. I hope you've enjoyed this first session, and I hope that at the end of it, maybe people will have moved on a little bit, have changed their minds. Maybe all of us will have changed our minds a little bit. But fundamentally, we all still have a will to win. So.